Hi, welcome to Saturday in the History video. I'd like to talk about the history of the income tax, because after all, the whole election is going to be about taxes, and it's very instructive to know what the history has been. There was briefly an income tax in the Civil War, but as soon as the war was over, Congress repealed it. And then it reenacted it in 1913 in a constitutional amendment. But it was a nominal tax. It wasn't until World War I, a few years later, that the income tax really rose high, partially to pay for the war spending, but also because of Prohibition, which passed at the same time the income tax was raised. Why Prohibition? Well, 2/3 of the federal government revenues came from the whiskey excise tax. Between whiskey and the tariff, that accounted for all the government revenues. We didn't really have other taxes in America. And if you're going to make whiskey illegal, you had to replace it, and they raised the income tax. And they raised it all the way up the top bracket to 70%. Well, after the war, the Republicans took over under Harding and then Coolidge, and they lowered the income tax rate from 70 back down to 25, which unleashed an incredible torrent of economic growth. You've heard of the Roaring '20s? Oh man, they were roaring. The percentage of Americans who owned a car rose from 25% to 75%. Living standards just soared, and that was largely because of the tax cut. Then the Great Depression hit because of the boom, the bust that followed the bubble of that prosperity. And government spending rose and government revenues dropped, and Herbert Hoover took over. And you know what he did? The moron raised taxes, raised the top bracket back up to the 70% level and even higher. And the result was that he took a stock market crash and he turned it into the Great Depression. The Depression was because of that tax increase, and also because the Fed chose then to raise interest rates. Just unbelievable. They wanted to restore business confidence, they said. Then FDR took over, and he kept taxes at the same level. But then in 1937, he raised taxes, partially to fund Social Security. And that caused a whole second depression, from 37 to 39. And we didn't get out of it until World War II, when we were in a period of prosperity. Now, in World War II, the top tax bracket rose to 91%. That's 9-1. No reason to get out of bed in the morning. And it stayed at 91% throughout the 40s and the 50s. And the result was that we had recession after recession after recession. We had recessions in 53, 55, and 57 under the Eisenhower administration because of the 91% tax bracket. They made it literally illegal to make a lot of money. Then Kennedy came in, a Democrat, and he said, this tax is ridiculous. We have got to lower it. And he proposed something radical, a 70% tax bracket. And Congress wouldn't pass it, the left wouldn't hear of it, but after his assassination, partially as a tribute to him, Congress passed his signature initiative and cut the tax rate to 70%. There it stayed in the 60s and the 70s, and you know how bad the 70s were for the economy. Huge unemployment, huge inflation, huge budget deficits. America was in terrible shape, largely because of a 70% tax rate. Then Reagan came in 81. And right off the bat, he cut taxes from 70 to 50, and then later from 50 down to 28. In 86, he gave ground a little bit and raised it back up to 35. And it stayed, and as a result, we had the 80s. We had the boom of the 90s. We had this absolutely incredible economic growth because of that massive cut in taxes that Reagan started with. Then when Bush Sr. came into office, he raised other taxes, but he kept the income tax where it was. But when Clinton came into office, he raised the tax rate from 35 to 40, 39.6. But then he cut the capital gains tax, and the revenues from the capital gains tax balanced the budget and really pulled the economy along. But when Bush came in, he said these tax rates are too high, and he cut the top rate back down to 35, where it stands today. Now in December, it's going to go back up to 40 unless the Republicans win, which I think they will, and they'll keep it at 35. But isn't it interesting throughout this last 100 years how every time you cut taxes, revenues rose and the economy turned on, and every time you raised taxes, the economy fell apart and revenues dropped? That's one of the reasons I'm pushing so hard for Herman Cain's 999 proposal, but we'll talk more about that later. Thanks for watching.